Welcome, students. Today we're putting on our historical detective hats for a brand new explainer. We're going to unpack the high-stakes, cutthroat, corporate, and imperial race for India, based strictly on our curriculum source document. Now, this isn't just a boring list of dates to memorize. Oh no, it's a dramatic saga full of mega-corporations, epic naval battles, and strategic masterstrokes. If you're prepping for your competitive exams, this is the exact documentary-style breakdown you need to absolutely ace it.
So think about this for a second. The year is 1453. The great, impenetrable city of Constantinople falls to the Turks. Literally overnight, the ancient land route between India and Europe is completely shut down. Europe is in an absolute panic. They desperately need Indian spices to preserve their food and flavor their meals, but their supply chain is completely severed. This one single bottleneck kicks off an unprecedented race across the world's oceans to find a new sea route to India.
With the land route totally blocked off, Portugal was actually the first to take the lead. You had Prince Henry of Portugal, famously known as the Navigator, who basically inspired his whole country to explore the unknown. This ambitious push culminated in Vasco da Gama sailing all the way around the southernmost tip of Africa, crossing the Indian Ocean with the help of an Indian pilot, and finally arriving at Calicut in 1498. By doing this, he completely altered the history of global trade forever. To make this super easy to memorize for your exams, just remember the mega corporation arrival sequence as PDBDF. That's the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, the Danish, and the French. And then finally, we'll cover exactly why the British won.
Starting right at the top of our list, Section 1, the Portuguese.
When Vasco da Gama first reached Calicut in 1498, he was actually welcomed cordially by King Zamorin. But, well, things went south pretty quickly. Conflict sparked when Pedro Álvares Cabral showed up in 1500 with a heavily armed fleet. The Portuguese immediately started setting up these fortified trading centers, which they called factories, all along the coastline. They made Cochin their very first capital in India. You see, they weren't just here to trade peacefully, they were here to completely dominate.
Let's look at the three key governors who made this happen. First, Francisco de Almeida arrived in 1505. His main goal was to shatter the Arab monopoly on Indian Ocean trade using his blue water policy, which was basically total naval supremacy. Next up is Alfonso de Albuquerque, and he is the real founder of Portuguese power in India. Why? Well, in 1510, he captured Goa from the Sultan of Bijapur and actively encouraged his men to marry Indian women to build a permanent local presence. Finally, Nino da Cunha officially moved the capital from Cochin to Goa in 1530, expanding their coastal monopoly even further to places like Bassein and Diu.
Okay, time for a quick 10-second exam revision on the Portuguese to lock this into your memory. Important dates: 1498 for da Gama's arrival, and 1510 for capturing Goa. Personalities: Almeida for the blue water policy, and Albuquerque as the true founder. Places to know: Cochin as the first capital, then Goa. And a couple of high-yield exam points: they introduced tobacco cultivation to India, set up the very first printing press in Goa in 1556, but ultimately they declined and lost their power to the Dutch in the 17th century.
Which brings us right to the challengers in Section 2, the Dutch.
So, in 1602, the United East India Company of the Netherlands was formed, and these guys meant serious business. They founded their first factory in Masulipatam in 1605. Pretty soon after, they captured Amboina from the Portuguese and built this massive stronghold in South India at Pulicat, completing the formidable Fort Geldria in 1613. From this base, they aggressively monopolized the trade in black pepper, silk, and cotton, just ruthlessly pushing the Portuguese out of the picture.
Here's your 10-second Dutch summary for the exams. Key dates: 1602 for their company formation and 1759 for their ultimate downfall. Places: they first settled at Masulipatam in 1605, and remember this major shift: they moved their headquarters from Pulicat to Nagapattinam in 1690. Now for the most frequently asked exam points. Remember their brutal rivalry with the British, especially the 1623 Amboina massacre where they killed English traders. And finally, know that their empire totally collapsed in India when they were crushed by the British at the Battle of Bedra.
Now we meet the ultimate victors of this entire saga in Section 3, the British. It all kicks off on December 31st, 1600, when Queen Elizabeth granted a royal charter. But, they didn't just walk in and take over on day one. It took a lot of careful diplomacy. Captain Hawkins visited Mughal Emperor Jahangir in 1608, but heavy Portuguese pressure actually blocked him at first. It wasn't until an English captain named Thomas Best defeated the Portuguese in a naval battle in 1612 that Jahangir was impressed enough to allow a British factory at Surat in 1613. Later, Sir Thomas Roe secured even wider commercial treaties. This success led to massive fortified expansions, like Francis Day leasing Madras to build Fort St. George in 1639, and Job Charnock establishing a settlement in 1690 that would eventually grow into the famous Fort William in Calcutta.
Now here's a totally fascinating historical quirk from our source about Bombay. You might be wondering, how exactly did the British get this vital port? Well, King Charles II of England actually received the island of Bombay as a dowry when he married the Portuguese princess Catherine. But a king didn't want to deal with managing some distant trading port himself, right? So he rented it out to the megacorporation, the East India Company, in 1668 for an annual rent of a mere £10. It's got to be one of history's greatest real estate bargains.
Let's lock in the British exam revision. 10-second summary. They arrived with a royal charter in 1600, used diplomacy and naval winds to get Mughal permissions, and built a massive fortress network. Important dates, 1757 and 1764. Key personalities, Captain Hawkins, Sir Thomas Roe, and Job Charnock. Places to memorize, Fort St. George in Madras and Fort William in Calcutta. And here is the absolute most critical exam point to remember. They decisively shifted from being just mere traders into an actual political power after winning two massive conflicts, the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and the Battle of Buxar in 1764.
Moving right along to the minor players, Section 4, the Danish, and briefly the Swedish.
The King of Denmark officially issued a charter in 1616. The Danish arrived and set up a really beautiful coastal settlement in 1620 at Tranquebar in Tamil Nadu, which they proudly named Danesborg. The impressive architecture of this fort still stands today. Later on, they established their main headquarters over in Serampore, Bengal in 1676.
While they definitely weren't major players in India, our source document does give us a quick piece of bonus trivia. The Swedish East India Company was founded in Gothenburg in 1731. They were directly inspired by the massive amounts of wealth they saw flowing back to the Dutch and the British, but honestly, they never made any significant dent in the Indian subcontinent.
Quick exam revision for the Danish. 10-second summary. Their legacy in India is much more cultural rather than commercial or military. Important personalities. Remember Ziegenbalg, who was sent by the King of Denmark. Important places. Tranquebar, because that's where he set up a highly important printing press. And the key exam takeaway for how their story ends. They completely failed to strengthen their political or military positions. They eventually just gave up and sold all their Indian settlements directly to the British in 1845.
Finally, we reach the final bosses of this era in Section 5, the French.
France was the absolute last European country to arrive in India as traders. Formed in 1664 by Minister Colbert under King Louis XIV, they were entirely a state-sponsored enterprise. François Couronne founded their first factory at Surat in 1667, but their real crown jewel was Pondicherry, founded in 1673 by François Martin, who built Fort St. Louis there. This French vision of building a grand Indian empire was dramatically reinforced in 1742 when a brilliant and highly ambitious man named Joseph-François Dupleix became governor. He didn't just want trade, he wanted territory.
Your 10-second French exam revision. Important dates. Formed in 1664, making them the absolute last to arrive. Personalities to know. Colbert, who formed the company, and Dupleix, their highly ambitious governor. Places. Pondicherry was their most prosperous settlement, secured by Fort St. Louis. Now, the most crucial exam point. Why did they fail? Our source explicitly states they ruined themselves by neglecting trade and getting deeply entangled in local Indian politics. They fought the 3 Carnatic Wars against the British, which massively drained their resources.
Which naturally leads us to our final section, number 6, why the British won.
So, how exactly did the British outlast everyone in this centuries-long corporate race? Our source document lays it out perfectly. The British won due to a killer combination of supreme commercial competitiveness, meaning they never ever forgot that they were a business first, meant to make money. Add to that their unwavering government support, their unmatched naval superiority, and a really strong national character. While the French made the fatal error of neglecting their trade to fight incredibly costly local wars, the British just used their immense trading wealth to fund their systemic territorial expansion. Simply put, they out-earned and out-navigated every single rival.
And this, students, brilliantly illustrates the delicate, unpredictable balance of history. It leaves us with a really provocative final thought for your studies today.
how one single strategic error by the French, prioritizing local warfare over global commerce, gave the British the ultimate edge to build an entire empire. If Governor Dupleix had focused purely on trade, just like the early British governors did, would we be learning a completely different history of India today? Keep that wild thought in mind as you prep for your exams. Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and happy studying.